We're now on Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis, the Isa, and if you're going to argue that if a person failed to leave an Erev Tavshilin and he baked for Shabbos, he's allowed to eat it on Shabbos, listen, the Tana of the Beitza should have pointed out, the Beitza was trying to address this problem. How do we guarantee that this man could have food for Shabbos? And the Beitza offered one solution, and that is that he should be makna his kemach to someone else, but it should have added over v'ofa mutter, that in a case where he already baked on Yontif for Shabbos without an Erev Tavshilin, he's allowed to eat. Again, this would not be a solution l'chatchila, but b'di'eved, it would be a solution. It shouldn't have been omitted from the Beitza. Omar of Adu bar Masna, Tana takanta de Tera Tani. Our Beitza is only interested in solving the problem l'chatchila, beheter. And what you could do is you could transfer ownership over your kemach to someone else. But takanta d'isura lo Tani. The Beitza is not addressing a situation in which he violated the Isur. He went in and he baked on Shabbos, on Yontif for Shabbos, without an Erev Tavshilin. That's not the subject of this Beitza. The Rishonim here have a problem because the Beitza omitted another possible solution, and that is what we called Ribui Shiurim, because we paskin that you're allowed to put extra dough in the oven, more than what you need for Yontif, and that's not a problem. So why didn't the Beitza mention that solution? And the answer is that apparently the Beitza is talking about a case where he already ate his Seudas Yontif. So therefore, he's not preparing for Yontif at all. Any baking that he would do after he ate the Seudas Yontif is purely for the sake of Shabbos. How can we allow that in a case where he didn't leave an Erev Tavshil? The answer is he could be makna his kemach to someone else, but there's no addressing the issue of what happens if he already baked for Shabbos. Toshma, let's determine this from a Beitza. Mishe niach a ruve tavshilin, a reza ofer mevashel umatmin, the imrotza lechol es a ruvo, parashus biyodo. Meaning he only has to keep the Erev alive and well until he bakes for Shabbos. Once he's already baked for Shabbos on Yontif, then he can eat the Erev. We have a minhag of eating the Erev for Shalosh Shudas. But Medina de Gemara, according to the Gemara, you don't have to wait till Shalosh Shudas. You can eat it on Yontif itself after you've eaten. After you've baked and cooked for Shabbos. Weiter. Acholo ad shelo ofel. If he consumed the Erev Tavshil before he got to bake for Shabbos. Oh, Shalo Bishel. He hasn't yet cooked for Shabbos. Or Ad Shalo Hitmin. Hareze lo yofer, velo yavasha, velo yatmin, lo velo achirim. Velo achirim ofen vashlim lo. Avol mevashel hu liyontiv. V'im hosir l'Shabbos. He could cook for Shabbos, for Yontif, and if he has leftovers, he'll eat that on Yontif. Ubilvad shelo yarin. Again, I don't know how to translate that into English, but I'm going to use the word subterfuge. Are you familiar with that word? In other words, harama means when I try to skirt around the law. That's called harama. It's a sugya all over Shas. In this case, what he's going to do is he's going to bake and cook a large amount of baking and cooking, knowing full well that he doesn't need it for Yontif. And he's going to say, you know what? Maybe guests will come on Yontif. So he's doing our Rama. Imherim Osu. In other words, the Chacham were machmir, and they said, we don't want to get rid of this takanas Erev Tavshilin, and people are going to be marim, and they're going to say, well, I don't need an Erev Tavshilin. I'll just make a statement that whatever I'm baking and whatever I'm cooking on Yontif is really for Yontif, because who knows if, some seminary where the girls are studying, they're going to run out of food, they'll send them all over to my place. So we don't allow for harama. And if we find out about it, then we're going to tell him that he's not allowed to eat the food that he cooked and baked for Shabbos. And the Gemara thinks by equation, by analogy, the same thing should apply in a case of someone who baked on Yontif for Shabbos without an Eruv. And we're going to say him Avar v'Afa Os. Omar Avashi. So now we're going to have two shitos in the Gemara to reject this analogy and this proof from the Bryce. So the first is Ravashi. Arama Kamrit. Yeah, it's true that in the case of Arama, we have to protect the Torah's Eruv. And the Achmere Beira Bonantfe, Shani Arama. We have to be more machmer in the case of Harama than in the case of someone who deliberately violated the law and baked or cooked on Yom Tov Shabbos without an Eruv. Why? Because in the case of Harama, the man fools himself. He convinces himself in his mind that, maybe guests will come when he knows there's very little chance that the guests will come. Once you allow for Harama, forget about Erev Tavshilin. Who's going to leave an Erev Tavshilin? They'll always claim, I'm baking for Archim on Yontif. But in the case of someone who deliberately violated the law and he baked on Yontif for Shabbos, he's, pardon the expression, he's a Rasha. And that's not going to lead to Akiras Torah's Erevin, meaning that the onlooker is going to say, oh, he got away with it, then we'll get away with it. They realize that he did it be'is. Rav Nachbar Yitzchak Amar, I have another way of deflecting this raya from the brisa of Harama. Hamani, the author of this brisa, Chananya, what good is Chananya in this context? Aliba de Beit Shammai, Chananya accepted the shita of Beit Shammai. And there is a chumrah of Beit Shammai, and Chananya accepted the chumrah of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai omrim, ein ofen elim kein erev bepas, v'ein mevashlim elkem erev betavshein, tomnim elim kein hayu chamin tmunim me erev yontif. In other words, according to Beit Shammai, we require as many as 3 different erev in erev tavshilin. We need a separate erev tavshilin of a cooked food for cooking, another one of a baked bread for baking, and a third one for atmana. All he needs is to cook one cooked food, and that'll cover him for bishul, for afiyah, for atmana. From the fact that Hananya accepted Beit Shammai lechumra with regard to leaving a separate erev for bishul, for afiyah, for atmana, we derive the conclusion that the same din would apply to the Eved if somebody went ahead without an erev and he cooked or he baked on Yontif for Shabbos, it's asur. We have to be machmir. You see how Chananya and Beit Shammai was so machmir with regard to erev tavshilim. Now the Gemara wants to quote another raya from a Mishnah in the second parak of Trumos with regard to Hafrashas Trumas and Maisris on Shabbos. Ha-ma'aser perosa b'Shabbos b'shogeg. If he violated the Isra Hafrashas Peros b'Shabbos, which is a drabanan and shvus, and he did it inadvertently, unintentionally, yochal, we're going to allow him to eat the grains or the fruits. But b'mezid, if he flagrantly and deliberately violated the Isra of Hafrashas Truma on Shabbos, then lo yeyachel. We're not going to allow him to eat the food that he meisered or he was mafresh Truma. We're going to impose a knas. And by the way, this is very similar to a Gemara in Masechet Bava Kama and also in Chulin, where the Gemara talks about the laws of knasos. If somebody violated the Shabbos, according to Rabbi Meir, if he violated the Shabbos to shogeg and he cooked something, then he's allowed to eat from that cooked food he doesn't get any knas because it was a shogeg. Mezid, Rabbi Meir says he's not allowed to eat the tavshil. Rabbi Yehuda says b'shogeg atavshil also. You're not allowed to eat even in the case of a shogeg. But we see in any event that there's a penalty that's imposed on the chachamim for someone who violated the law. And the machlokas is whether that applies to shogeg. Our Gemara reflects the shita of Rabbi Meir that in the case of shogeg there is no knas. And all this is important because as a result, if you tell him he's not allowed to eat it, like for example, in the case of Mezid, then you're undermining his own Shabbos. He won't have food for Shabbos. So Gemara says, Lo tzricha, the islay pereach riti. The case here in the Mishnah in Trumos is talking about a case where he has plenty of food. This is not his last desperate food. He's desperate for food. However, if somebody cooked on Yontif for Shabbos without an Eruv, and he has no other supply of food for Shabbos, and what's in the balance now on Shabbos, then will be permissible. Toshma, we learned from the same Mishnah, but this is the earlier part of the Mishnah. Hamatvil Kalev b'Shabbos. Again, he didn't carry out his Kalim on Shabbos to Rishus HaRabim to put him in a mikvah in a public area, because that would be a Meleches Hotzo. We're dealing with the Drabanan, but he's got a mikvah in his backyard, and he went in and he violated the Itzer, the prohibition in Rabbanan of being makvil a keli into a mikvah on Shabbos. Is b'shogeg, is he allowed to use these kelim? If he did it b'shogeg, then yishtamish b'hen. B'mezid lo yishtamish b'hen. So from the fact that you're not allowed to use these vessels because he violated these tvila b'mezid on Shabbos, we should derive the conclusion that if somebody without an Eruv, he baked or cooked on Yontif for Shabbos, it should be also. Mara says, once again, lo tricha. The case of the Mishnah is the Islay money achrini. He has other kelim. These are not the only kelim he has. In our case, we want to be matir the afia because he has no other food for Onik Shabbos. Inami, efshar b'she'ela. Even if he doesn't have any kelim in possession, he can borrow kelim from a neighbor. But as far as the Avar V'Ofa, our suffix is concerned, if he doesn't have any other food and the entire enterprise of Onik Shabbos is in the balance, then we don't know the answer to the question. Oshma, same Mishnah, Hamavatel b'Shabbos b'Shogeg Yochal b'Mezid Lo Yeochel. In other words, if you violated Shabbos and you cooked on Shabbos, if you did it b'shogeg, then you're allowed to eat from that tavshil, as we saw in Rabbi Meir. But b'mezid lo yachel, he's not allowed to eat it. So we see the Chachamim are being machmir, even at the stake of bittul onig yontif, onig Shabbos in this case. Gemara says that's no proof. Isur the Shabbat shiny. If you're talking about violating the Shabbos and he cooked on Shabbos, that's a chiyuv skila. But to cook on Yontif for Shabbos without an Eruv is only a Drabanan. I'm not sure that we should be machmir and tell him that he can't eat on Shabbos that which he cooked on Yontif. And the Gemara leaves this as an unanswered question. The Rosh tries to prove that La Halacha will be Mekil, and if he violated the Eruv, will allow him to eat. Beit Shammai Omrim, go back to the Mishnah, Shnei Tavshilin. Beis Hillel Omrim, Tavshil Echad. Both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, the Mishnah records, agree if you take an egg and you smear it on a fish and you bake the fish or you roast the fish, that's called Shnei Tavshilin, and it fulfills the qualification of Erev Tavshilin, even according to Beit Shammai. Gemara says, Masnisin Delo Ki Haitana. We have a different record or transmission of the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai in the following brayso. The Saya Omer of Shimon ben Elazar, Modin, even Beis Hillel agree, Beit Shammai Beis Hillel, Al Shnei Tavshilin Shetzarech, that even Beis Hillel agree, there was never a debate about this, that an Erev Tavshilin requires two Tavshilin, which by the way is our minhag. Alman nechleku, al dog u beitza she, al add the word tachu osa ola. The only machlokas is how to define the case where he adds the eggs to the fish and then he bakes the fish. Is it 2 tavshilin or 1 tavshilin? That's the whole stay machlokas. Beit Shammai omrim shnei tavshilin. Ubeis Hillel omrim tavshil echad. So what does it mean? Beit Shammai omrim shnei tavshilin. Rashi explains shnei tavshil means he has to add another tavshil because these are considered 1 tavshil. And Beis Hillel says, no, these are 2 tavshilin. There's no need to add another tavshil. But v'shavim, what happens if you have 2 foods? Each one was prepared separately, and then you combine them together. She'im pirper beitza, he had a cooked egg, a boiled egg, and then he breaks up the egg into small pieces together with a dag, with a fish or anything else. Nasan l'tov dag. That's considered, according to everyone, to fulfill Shnei Tavshil, because the egg in that sense was a separate entity. Oh, alternatively, another case, Terisek Kaflutos. Kaflutos are what we call karti. I think in English is leeks, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a vegetable. And he took this vegetable and he sliced it up into small pieces. V'nasan l'tov dag, and then he put it together with the fish and he cooked the fish. Everybody agrees, shehein shnei tavshilin, that's an erev and it's valid because each one was prepared on its own. Omar Rava Hilchasa Ketana Dinan, the halacha is like our Mishnah, that the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai is whether or not you need 2 tavshilin. Val leave the Beis Hillel, and we paskin according to Beis Hillel that all you need is 1 tavshilin. The Mishnah says, Ochlo osha avad areze lo yivashal olav. If before you started your cooking process, the erev got lost, it got consumed, you're in trouble. However, what happens if you began the process, but you didn't complete the process, and then in the meantime, the erev got lost? Amar Abaye Naktinan, we accept halacha that hischil be saso, v'nechal eruvo gomer. If he already began the process of afia, of baking, and he already began to create a dough, Isa is a dough. So although he hasn't baked it yet, and the erev got lost or consumed, he's allowed to complete baking it and put it into the oven. And the reason for this is because he's already begun the process of preparing for Shabbos, and he still had the erev. Now, there's a very strange Rashi here that I wanted to point out. Rashi, Ibra Maskel Im, see if I can find it here. Oh, here it is. It's about 10 lines up. At the end of the skinny lines in Rashi, Rashi says, Hiskil be isasol litakna ulafosa. So what does that mean, lafosa? I mean, he hasn't yet baked it. So they reinterpret Rashi, and they say that Rashi means lisakna kidei lafosa, meaning he made the dough, everything is ready to go in, all systems go to bake it, and he hasn't baked it. The Rosh has an interesting suffix. Ha'im hutalo legamrei chak esa isa atavshil she'ista bohem. What heter does Abaye speak about? is Abai allowing him to continue the cooking of this particular dough, this loaf of bread? Or does Abai say that now, since he began his baking, he can continue even after the loss of his Eruv to cook and to bake, and it's a blanket head? And the Rush leaves this as an open question. So now we're up to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Yud Zayin Omid Beis, and that will be covered by the next shir.